Good. All right, so I did my research on the waves of revolution from 1917 to 1923. 23. So I first started out my research on the specifically the revolution in Ireland during this time, and in my research I found a map of showing some revolutions in just Europe. There it is. When I was looking in for Ireland, and that's the revolutions during this 5 year period. All of these countries had some kind of change in government style or fighting against imperialism, like down in the south in Egypt, that they're fighting against British colonialism. But most of them, especially out west, were because of Russia. This was the start of the USSR. So a lot of those Western European countries were all socialism. So all those right there on there, all of them socialism pretty much. So a lot of these were in Europe, but it wasn't just Europe. There was a lot of other countries that had different things. So the first thing we're going to go over is the importance of the Russian Revolution. This was the spark that started it all. Crazy important revolution, just the history of the world, but especially in this period. Next is just some of the European ones, the more important ones, things like Italy and Ireland, because I already did research on that one, and then non-European ones. We don't want to just be Eurocentric in history. We got to look at everything else, not just Europe, which is a problem sometimes. But first, Russia. So uh, there's some important pictures. The sheer amount of communist revolutions during this time was all because of these guys right here. All right, with all this information that I was looking at, they had a monarchy for a long time. Russia did, czars, all that stuff. But during World War One, Russia was in a bad place. They were losing soldiers constantly, and they were getting treated terribly by people, and they wanted changes. So they began losing control of the front lines out west. Yeah, west. And I mean, people were just like getting angry. They were leaving front lines. They were just straight up rebelling, and it became an outright rebellion in 1917. And the last czar during that time was Nicholas II. After that, they just ousted him, they got rid of him, and it was replaced by a provisional government that still didn't want to end the war. Most people wanted the war to be over. Most soldiers and just common men wanted the war to be over, but the new government didn't. And so, at that point, the Bolshevik leader, Mr. Vladimir Lenin himself, started making a move for power when his government became extremely unlikable. And that became the October Revolution, which is the most important revolution in the USSR because it created it. In just 8 months, they became from a monarchy to a provisional government to just straight up a communist country. It's real fast, a quick turnaround. And after that, there's much more that happened. I'm going over it very, very quickly. There's so much that happened just in this revolution alone, but it was the spark that really caused a lot of people to, think about, oh, communism, socialism, this could be a good thing, and that's what happened later in the European ones. So while Russia was doing that, and the rest of Europe was covering from World War One, there was a lot of people who were, getting ready for a movement to power. There was just so many communist revolutions, I couldn't really go over all of them. It was just mostly Western Europe. But two important ones were Italy, which is, Benito Mussolini right there. Italy was an important one, and Germany. I'll go over Italy. Everyone knows what happened to Germany with the socialism and all that, but Italy is an important one. So during a time called the Two Red Years was a very uh, uneasy time in Italy. It wasn't outright rebellion yet. There were a lot of movements and fights, but there wasn't any like crazy huge uprisings. It was just a lot of political strife. And during that time, they saw socialism as an evil thing, which still is today. Well, I mean, that's a kind of whatever. I'm not going to get into that. But they saw another system of government as a more patriotic and better version of government, and it was fascism. Fascism at this time was completely new. People didn't I mean, it wasn't a thing yet. It was mostly monarchies at this time. So fascism, when it came around, people were starting to think, oh, this is patriotic. It's better than the evil socialism. So, I mean, that belief in fascism during a time where it was just completely new, is what led Benito Mussolini to take power, and as well as Germany to do its thing. One knows what happened there. But Italy was, socialism for a time, then they went to fascism. Now, not all these revolutions were related to socialism. Ireland wasn't. Ireland was its own thing. They just didn't like, they weren't fans of Britain. They wanted their independence, their anti-colonialism against the British rule. But since they've been calling it for since 1880, but Britain refused to give it to them. So they declared themselves independent in 1919, and Britain started to intervene. It was a long, long war, but it was only until 1921 where a truce was called, and Britain granted them the status of free state, and they still stayed under British rule, but they were given more power to govern themselves. And also, Britain kept 6 northern counties, which is Northern Ireland today. Now, moving into another one, and this was Greece. Greece was a good one too. We find a less socialist revolution, more one that fights against the monarchy, like many of the other ones, but this one was just non-socialist. So it was just a split between monarchy supporting group and a democratic supporting group. And during the war, they stayed neutral during World War One, and they were mostly neutral for most of the time, but they were pulled into the war by their own government in 1917. They gained land because of this, but for a long time, they were just kind of just all around just a weird, unstable place. So for 4 years, they just kept on kind of fighting between each other. But they ousted the king. King came back, then was ousted again and replaced by his oldest son. So a lot happened in Greece, but it was an interesting time for them. Now, that's just European ones, and that's only 3 of them. There were a lot more, but we don't want to always stay in Europe, so we can go to other places like Egypt. There, and Mexico, because that one's special to me. Egypt was extremely anti-colonialism. They had been ruled over by Britain for a long time, and they wanted it done. I mean, most people, educated people in Egypt, knew about it, and they Britain anyways. But most of the common man didn't until World War One happened. They had just been kind of just screwed over by Britain, like many of the colonial states, and so they were used during the war as kind of like they had soldiers taken from them by other armies, and they were just kind of forced into it. And when they wanted a seat at the Paris table, they were denied. They wanted to be their own country, but they were completely denied because Britain still lorded over them. So many of their nationalist leaders, went around. They were becoming popular, and when Britain arrested them and sent them out that day, the entire country revolted in 1919. So they revolted, but nothing really came of it. They're kind of giving the government. They're kind of not. Britain still ruled over them for a long time. Egypt was just been unstable for most of the 20th century, which was quite unfortunate for them. And another one that happened at the same time was Mexico. Mexico was having their own revolution with their own stuff. Francisco Madero was a huge political figure at the time, and he wanted to remove the current leader, who was a crazy dictator, who wanted to modernize Mexico by building railroads and destroying sacred land and a lot of farmland. This one is crazy long. I mean, this lasted for a long time after and during this time. So there was only a little bit that happened during the 5-year span that I was going over. But this one is important to me because I have family who were actually in Pancho Villa's, brigade. They took part in this revolution. I wish I could have found some information about that, but I couldn't find any. I just know I have a lot of family from Mexico, so they were during that. So, in review, the importance of the Russian Revolution cannot be overstated because it was a spark that led to so many other people thinking about, like socialism, let's give it a shot, or socialism is evil, let's go to fascism. And that was a lot of Europe. And a lot of people focused on Europe during the World Wars eras because, I mean, that was the big convulsing area point. But there were so many more places that changed because of that. You know, Mexico was becoming its own weird situation. Greece, or not Greece, Greece is in Europe. No, I mean Egypt, a lot of African countries. I mean, Malta was also a part of this, but I couldn't fit them in. I don't want to go crazy. I just want you to know that because this is a concept that I didn't know existed until I did this research. There are so many evidence or so many points of waves of revolution. We're in one now with all these protests against police brutality in here in Hong Kong and all over the place against political strife. We're in one now. They're the ones from 1960s, the civil rights movement, also another one, the one during the American Revolution, during all of that. All these times are waves of revolution. They're ideas and, changes that people make towards their country and everything else. These are, I mean, this is a concept I didn't even know existed, but I mean, we're in one now. So, go out there, be a part of it. It's fun. Any questions?
Oh, it's really good, you guys.
Yeah, I have a comment first. I love how passionate you were about that. That was very